Allison Powell, Advisory Teacher. Thank you for tuning in to this training pack for schools including pupils with Down syndrome. It's an overview. It's designed specifically for those schools teams new to working with pupils with Down syndrome. It's also hopefully going to be a useful resource to top up training for school teams who've been working with pupils with Down syndrome already, and for new members of staff within familiar teams. Split up into 4 sections. This first section is a look at the specific learning profile that is Down syndrome and the key messages around that teachers and support staff need to be aware of. The second pack looks very specifically at the first 20 minutes of a lesson. We've found over the years that getting that first 20 minutes right seems to be the best recipe for success. It settles pupils with Down syndrome really successfully, and the rest seems to flow quite naturally from there. So that's the second pack. Third pack is how to look at sustaining concentration and focus and engagement across the whole full hour long lesson. So a little bit of a toe dip into the rest of the lesson. And finally, a really brief look at a pack of resources that will come out to schools from your school's advisory teacher, which we've called the DS Toolkit. It's a pack of template resources that are designed to enable easy on-the-spot differentiation, and so they're really useful resource for teaching staff and support staff to be aware of. Okay, so all 4 packs will be available to all staff. So the support package that you would normally get is obviously going to look a bit different because of COVID-19. For the time being, we're only delivering support remotely, and that will involve video training and slide sets sent to your schools so that teams can train in their own time, with a follow-up live Q&A session on Teams or Zoom or whatever package is best suited for your school. So we can pre-book those sessions in, and then there will be ongoing remote contact with your advisor in the form of email, FaceTime, Zoom, whatever you want, with a follow-up planned session in the second half of the autumn term where you can address any specific questions in more detail and send us through any evidence that you want us to kind of take a look at, any problematic lesson, any evidence of any behaviour, so any video footage, photographs, lesson plans, that sort of thing, that you want us to really tackle in that second follow-up session. And we will then review the situation closer to Christmas with a view to what the support service will look like in 2021. But in the meantime, please don't hesitate to get in touch at any time if there's any specific questions. So the top message then, when it comes to including a pupil with Down syndrome, top of the slide set that accompanies this chunk of the training pack, is social integration, because it's absolutely the key. If you don't feel one of the gang in any situation, no matter who you are, how old you are, if you are in an environment where you don't feel socially included, socially immersed, then you're not going to be feeling your best and you're not going to be giving your best work. And so social integration absolutely underpins the success of the whole placement. To an extent, this needs to be planned for with pupils with Downs, particularly from top juniors and up into secondary. Some aspects of that will need addressing in terms of social communication work, for instance. Some schools find they've needed to introduce a light kind of circle of friends program or a buddy system to just scaffold those unstructured times a little bit at the beginning. But the good news is that by far and away the biggest impact on social inclusion and social integration for a pupil with Down syndrome is to look at the nature of their experience of a lesson. TA support needs to be light touch. It's got to be delivered from standing. It's got to be delivered in short bursts with lots of opportunity, peppering every lesson for that pupil to sit at a table with work in front of them, surrounded by their peers, and feel as if they are accessing that lesson on the same terms as everybody else. To pace a lesson so that there's not always adult input, to pace a lesson so that the pupil can change the pace and the nature of how they're learning and experiencing, but also to create space, because that space around the pupil, space away from adult presence, immediate adult presence, means that your pupils with Down syndrome could do what they do best, which is to watch, observe and mimic their peers. It does mean you need to give careful thought to seating, so those peers that are closest to them and within eyesight need to be your strongest role models. A lot of pupils with Down syndrome will mimic the behaviours they see around them, and if those behaviours being mimicked are absolutely spot on what you want in your classroom, then that's the best recipe for success. But that space and that pace of learning means that the pupils can not only listen and mimic, but also get that sense of seeing themselves present in that classroom on the same terms as everybody else. The way their lesson looks to them looks the same as it does to those around them. I don't always have to have an adult helping me. I sometimes do it on my own, and sometimes when I can't, my friends lean in and help me. My friends lean in and repeat an instruction for me. And all of that makes for a much stronger self-esteem for anybody, not just the pupil with Down syndrome. But with pupils with Down syndrome, it's that creates an ethos that enables your pupil with Down syndrome to thrive and to encourage engagement and learning and academic and cognitive progress. And so planning to do less in class, for your support teams to do less in class, to reduce their presence, is your best bet forward. And the key headline there is lose the chair. There shouldn't be, by top juniors and certainly into secondary, there shouldn't be a permanently allocated chair next to your pupil with Down syndrome. By all means, pull up a chair, pull up a stool for short bursts of direct input, and know that when you're doing that, that's the moment that you're teaching. But you can't sustain that for an hour. And if that empty chair is there permanently throughout, then it's acting as a barrier to friendship. It's a visual sign, not only to the people with Down syndrome, but to the peers around them, that this pupil is different. This pupil will need an adult, and therefore it does create a sense of separation and act as a barrier. So lose the chair, drop in for seated or crouched support, or deliver support from standing, leaning over shoulder, and get used to that different rhythm. It makes all the difference. And the other really important part of enabling social integration as a school is to embrace the fact that as a school you are now an inclusive environment. You've been an inclusive environment probably for many years, but having the presence of a pupil with Down syndrome is an opportunity. It's an opportunity for the whole community of the school to learn new things about Down syndrome, to learn new things about themselves. The easiest place to start with this is a lovely little video. It's available on YouTube. There's a link to it in the slides. It's called Just Like You. It's 11 minutes long. 3 pairs of American high schoolers, 3 pairs of friends. Each friendship pair includes people with Down syndrome. Really informative, really uplifting, and very accessible. 11 minutes long, so it's perfect for a tutor time session for the whole year group or a whole year group assembly. So check that out and consider showing that and raising the profile of Down syndrome right from the start. So the specific learning profile. Down syndrome is not a generalised learning disability. Not everything is harder. It's a spiky profile, and that means that it does come with some very definite and specific strengths. And knowing those up front is really useful, because playing to those strengths is your best way forward. Top of the list, really, and encompassing all the other strengths, is the fact that children with Down syndrome and young people with Down syndrome are strong visual learners. Their short-term visual memory is a real strength, and so using visual learning strategies is by far and away the most successful. There is an ability and a desire to learn from peers. The most common profile associated with pupils with Down syndrome is a huge peer motivation. It doesn't always apply because everybody's different, but in the majority of cases there's a huge need to observe and mimic the peers and be one of the gang, so use that. An ability to learn to read, because reading is a visual strength. Reading in children with Down syndrome is achieved most successfully by whole word sight recognition rather than the use of phonics. We'll come on to why that is in a little while. To learn from concrete materials, to be able to manipulate something by hand and move things around, that kinesthetic form of learning is also really impactful. Despite language problems, children with Down syndrome and young people with Down syndrome are natural communicators. They've got a natural inclination to communicate. What that does mean is that when they can't make themselves understood, they are naturally inclined to use gesture, body language, facial expression. And when that doesn't work, the downside of that can be that if we're not hearing them, if we're not trying hard enough to understand what they're saying, then that can result in using behaviour to communicate their problem, to show you that something's really not right. They thrive on structure and routine because it's visual, because it's kinesthetic. Once that routine is under their belt and they've committed that to their long-term memories, they're very unlikely to stray from that. And finally, the ability to use sign and gesture, which we've already talked about a little bit. Lots of children with Down syndrome learn in the early stages to communicate via keyword signing, and although they don't always carry that on right the way through till secondary age, they nevertheless do benefit from some keywords being signed just to help them latch on to that verbal information a little bit more successfully. So what's tricky? On your slide set you'll see a slide depicting the phonological loop. This is the way in which we all process verbal information. It's in your short-term memory. In the normal course of things, we hear all the component parts of a sound or an unfamiliar word, and we kind of replay that on a loop in your articulatory rehearsal. We play it over and over again so that we can start to unpick it, to hear every component part, and to commit it to memory, so that we're then able to repeat it or act on that information or that instruction. In children with short-term auditory memory problems, this phonological loop is impaired, and that's absolutely lying at the heart of the cognitive disability that is Down syndrome. So you'll see that depicted on the next slide. The child with short-term auditory memory issues will, first of all, not reliably hear all the component parts. Lots of children with Downs have cognitive or conductive or fluctuating hearing loss, and so you can't reliably guarantee that they've heard all the component parts to begin with. But then what's happening is that articulatory rehearsal is nowhere near as thorough, lasting as long as it is in typically developing pupils. So what gets committed to their long-term memory is only part of the story. And then that makes reproducing that word in speech even more difficult, added to which you've got motor difficulties in the jaw and the tongue to get your mouth physically around that language, but it's not there in your memory first of all either, necessarily, or not there in full. When it comes to acting on a verbal instruction, it means you've only really held on to part of the story. And so you need to rely on other things to get you through in the course of every moment of every day. And so that multitask, that holding on to what you can hear, checking out the visuals around you, the body language, the gesture, the facial expressions, and trying to compensate for those bits that you haven't processed. That's what's happening all the time with your pupil with Down syndrome, and it's exhausting. So the implications of that are quite significant. It's broken down for you on the issues page, the issues with Down, which lie at the core of all of these challenges. So you've got conductive or fluctuating hearing loss, the poor working memory, so that that short-term memory isn't holding on to that information for very long. The phonological loop isn't able to decode and unpick all of those sounds, certainly isn't able to hold on to all of that information in sequential order, so the sequence will be missed and messed up. It also has an impact on reading. Whilst children with Down syndrome often are strong readers and can develop their reading ability to really quite a good age, quite often people with Down syndrome have a reading age which matches their chronological age by junior school. But their comprehension age is by far outstripped by that reading age, because in the short-term memory, although they can recognise the words in print, they're not holding on to the sound of them when they read through them in sequential order. So reading for comprehension is a bigger challenge. The good news, like I said up front, is that the visual memory is really strong, and that can be brought into play in the classroom to help compensate for all of those difficulties. In short then, what's difficult in a classroom environment when you have short-term auditory memory issues associated with Down syndrome? Learning from listening, the single hardest thing we can ask of our pupils with Downs. Multitasking is really hard. Reading for comprehension is a multitask. It's the act of sight reading the words on the page, coupled with the act of holding on to the sound of those in your working memory in sequential order long enough to decode for meaning. And that's a really difficult ask. It also means expressing your knowledge and understanding in writing is a challenge, because there's the information that you've got in your head coupled with the act of composing a sentence, spelling a word, forming a letter. Those two acts together mean that what you get in writing is not a true indication of the level of knowledge and understanding. So you need to come at that in a different way. Expressing your needs, expressing your sense of any malaise or illness, for example, is often impaired in children with Down syndrome. When we're feeling under the weather, we all know if we're poorly, if we're stressed and anxious, quite often it's the capacity to formulate, clearly express ourselves that goes, first of all. I'm experiencing a bit of that right now. A bit of stress of being filmed and my words are going. We all know and we all experience that feeling. In Down syndrome, that's very, very prominent. And so a change of behaviour, a sudden change of behaviour, seeing things that are uncharacteristic for the pupil once you've got to know them, is often a sign that something's not right. Either that they're sickening for something, or that there is a sense of anxiety in that environment in that moment. Okay. Supporting with clear, meaningful visuals, photographic, text, interactive, kinesthetic, concrete resources. All of those visual and kinesthetic approaches will enable better processing, better retention, and better consolidation of knowledge. So that's your way in. Knowing and understanding that's important. We can't completely compensate, and that's not what this is about. In the act of education for a pupil with Down syndrome is enabling them to develop a body of knowledge and a body of compensatory skills so that they can function in this busy, talk-heavy world. The DS Toolkit, which will come out to schools with you, and there is a separate training pack which will go with that. The DS Toolkit is designed specifically to help compensate for some of these challenges.